My name is Natalie, and I am 32 years old. I work as a forensic accountant at a downtown corporate firm. My career is built on tracking missing money, uncovering hidden assets, and exposing financial liars. I am the person you call when the numbers do not add up. But nothing prepared me for the ultimate fraud happening inside my own family. The phone call came at 4 on a rainy Tuesday. A stern woman on the line did not introduce herself. She just said, "Your daughter has not been picked up and it has been 3 hours." I laughed and told her she had the wrong number. I said, "I do not have a daughter and I am single." Her voice turned ice cold. She said, "We have your emergency contact information and your address. Just come to Oak Creek Elementary right now, or we are calling the cops on you for child neglect." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your intelligence. Trust me, you will want to hear how I legally dismantled their entire lives. My heart hammered against my ribs. I grabbed my coat and drove through the Chicago traffic, my mind racing with a million terrifying scenarios. I walked into the main office of the school completely out of breath. Sitting in a chair in the corner clutching a stuffed bear was not a stranger. The little girl sitting there was my 6-year-old niece Lily. I approached the front desk trying to keep my voice steady. I told the receptionist there had been a huge mistake. I explained that I was Lily's aunt, not her mother, and that her real mother, my sister Courtney, must have put my name down on the pickup list by accident. The receptionist glared at me and pressed a button on her desk phone. A moment later, a tall, imposing school resource officer stepped into the room, followed by the school principal. The principal did not look amused. She dropped a thick folder onto the counter between us. She said, "We do not make mistakes with our student records." She opened it and slid an official state birth certificate toward me. I stared at the paper, my blood running cold. There, printed clearly under the section for the legal mother, was my full legal name, my date of birth, my social security number. I felt the room spin. I tried to push the paper back, my hands trembling. I told them this was a forgery, that my sister Courtney and her husband Terrence were the parents. The principal crossed her arms and looked at the police officer. She told me to stop playing games. She pulled out a stack of residency documents, a lease agreement, and a utility bill, all bearing my name and my exact apartment address. The school had been operating under the assumption that I was the primary caregiver this entire time. The police officer took a step closer to me, resting his hand near his utility belt. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Ma'am, according to the state of Illinois, you are the legal guardian of this child. If you walk out those doors without her, I am placing you under arrest for child abandonment. You will be sitting in a jail cell tonight." I could not breathe. My own older sister had stolen my identity to register her child in one of the wealthiest public school districts in the entire state. But the forged birth certificate meant this went way deeper than just lying about an address for a better school. This was federal identity theft. I looked over at Lily. Her big brown eyes were filled with tears, and she looked so incredibly small. I knew that if I refused to take her, she would be handed over to the foster care system before sunset. My family had backed me into a terrifying legal corner. I swallowed my panic, nodded to the officer, and signed the late pickup release forms. My signature matched the fake signatures on the forged documents perfectly, which only made me feel so much sicker inside. I gently took Lily by the hand and quietly walked her out to my parked car. As I buckled her into the back seat, the reality of the situation crashed over me. I shut the heavy car door, pulled out my cell phone, and immediately dialed my sister, Courtney's number. The loud dial tone rang in my ear, and I promised myself that whoever answered was going to face the wrath of a woman who destroys fraudsters for a living. The line connected on the fourth ring. A blast of heavy bass and the rhythmic thumping of club music immediately flooded my car speakers. Over the noise, I heard my sister Courtney laughing loudly. She yelled into the receiver, asking who was calling her while she was trying to order premium tequila shots. I kept both hands gripped tightly on the steering wheel, and told her it was Natalie. I demanded to know exactly what she had done with her daughter and my identity. Courtney let out a dramatic sigh that I could hear even over the loud music. She told me I was always so intensely dramatic and asked why I was bothering her on her vacation. I told her I was currently driving away from Oak Creek Elementary with her child because the school principal and a police officer had just threatened to lock me in a holding cell for child neglect. I demanded an explanation for why my full legal name, my social security number, and my exact home address were perfectly printed on Lily's state-registered birth certificate and residency files. Courtney just giggled. Her voice slurred slightly, making it obvious she was already intoxicated. She said, "Oh, right, that little paperwork mix-up. Terrence and I needed to get Lily into the Oak Creek School District because the public schools in our neighborhood are absolute garbage. We just used your information to make things smoother. It is really not a big deal." I snapped back that faking an address is a misdemeanor, but completely forging a legal birth certificate and listing me as the biological mother is a massive federal felony. I asked her where she even was and how long she planned on abandoning her kid. She proudly bragged that she and Terrence were currently in Cabo San Lucas. She said they were staying at an exclusive 5-star all-inclusive luxury resort for the next 2 weeks. She told me Terrence had been incredibly stressed with his new business ventures and they desperately needed a romantic getaway to reconnect. She actually had the nerve to tell me to stop acting like a victim and just do my duty for the family. She said Lily is an easy kid, just feed her some chicken nuggets, let her watch her tablet and keep her alive until we get back. My vision went red. As a forensic accountant, my brain instantly started running the numbers. Terrence had not held a steady job in 3 years. Courtney worked part-time at a clothing boutique. There was absolutely no way they could afford a 2-week luxury vacation in Cabo on their own dime. A sickening realization began to form in my mind. I told Courtney she had exactly 5 seconds to give me a legitimate reason why I should not drive straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and report her for identity theft. I told her I would have her and Terrence arrested in handcuffs the second their plane touched down in Chicago. Before Courtney could respond, the line clicked. A third voice joined the call. It was my mother, Patricia. Courtney had apparently merged her into a 3-way call before even answering my initial ring. My mother's sharp, disapproving voice cut through the background music like a knife. She told me to lower my voice and stop threatening my sister immediately. She casually mentioned that she had known about this special arrangement for months and that I was being completely unreasonable. I was stunned. My own mother knew about this massive legal fraud and helped them cover it up. Patricia continued her lecture, her tone dripping with utter condescension. She said Courtney has sacrificed her entire youth to raise that child, and Terrence is a proud black man working very hard to provide a good image for his family. You are a single woman with an empty apartment, no husband, and entirely too much free time. You should be honored that they trust you enough to let you help raise your niece. Do not ruin your sister's rare getaway with your selfish career woman attitude. I told my mother this was not about free babysitting. I told her this was about forging federal documents and making me legally responsible for a human being I did not give birth to. Patricia scoffed loudly and said it was just paper. She told me to grow up, be a team player for once in my miserable life, and hung up the phone. A second later, Courtney laughed, yelled "Bye, loser," and ended the call, too. The silence in my car was deafening. I drove through the Chicago rain, my knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. I had always been the scapegoat of the family, the one expected to clean up Courtney's messes while she was treated like an absolute princess. But this was beyond toxic. This was criminal. I looked in the rearview mirror at Lily. She was staring out the window, her small hands clutching her teddy bear tightly to her chest. I took a deep breath, trying to force my voice to sound calm and comforting. I asked Lily if she was hungry, and if she wanted to stop somewhere for dinner before we went to my place. Lily did not look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the rain sliding down the dark glass. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she told me a terrifying secret. She said, "Mommy Nat, please do not call the police on Daddy Terrence. He told me if I do not pretend you are my mommy to the teachers, he will make sure the bad men come and lock me in a dark cage forever. And he said, if I tell anyone about the game we play with the papers, he will hurt you too. I heard the words, but it took a moment for my brain to process the sheer evil behind them. I pulled my car into the underground parking garage of my downtown condominium building and killed the engine. I unbuckled my seatbelt, turned all the way around, and looked Lily right in the eyes. I kept my voice incredibly steady, burying the absolute rage that was boiling inside my chest. I told her that Terrence was a liar. I promised her that no bad men were ever going to take her away and no one was going to put her in a cage. I told her she was safe with me and that nobody was going to hurt us. Lily gave a tiny nod, but her small shoulders were still trembling. I led her upstairs to my apartment. The quiet, organized space of my home usually brought me immediate peace after a long day of dealing with corporate fraud, but tonight it felt like a war room. Lily's clothes were damp from the rain outside the school, and she was shivering. I told her we were going to draw a nice warm bubble bath to help her warm up and wash off the stressful day. I went into the guest bathroom, started the warm water, and poured in some lavender soap I kept for myself. I called Lily in and helped her pull her damp pink sweater over her head. As the fabric cleared her arms, I stopped dead in my tracks. My breath hitched in my throat. Spanning across her left upper arm were 3 distinct oval-shaped bruises. They were a mixture of sickly yellow and fading purple. I gently took her arm and turned it slightly. On the inside of her bicep was a 4th bruise perfectly aligning with where a thumb would press if an adult had grabbed her violently. This was not a playground injury. These were the unmistakable marks of a grown man grabbing a small child with extreme force. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I knelt down to her eye level and softly asked her how she got those marks. Lily immediately panicked. Her eyes darted toward the bathroom door as if Terrence was going to walk through it. She grabbed my wrists and started crying, begging me not to tell Daddy. She said she got them because she kept forgetting the rules to the game. I asked her what rules she meant. Through her tears, she explained the sick coaching sessions Terrence and Courtney had put her through. She said Terrence would sit her in a chair in their living room and drill her for hours. He made her memorize my full name, my phone number, and my address. He told her she had to practice calling me Mommy Nat every single time they played school. When she accidentally called Courtney Mommy during the drill, Terrence would grab her arm tightly and shake her, yelling that she was going to get them all arrested. He told her the police had a special dark cage just for little girls who did not listen to their daddies. He conditioned her to lie to the teachers, to the principal, and to the school resource officer out of pure, unadulterated terror. The realization hit me like a freight train. This was not some impulsive, stupid mistake my sister made to get her kid into a better school zone. This was a calculated, long-term manipulation. They had systematically brainwashed and physically abused a 6-year-old girl just to maintain a cover story. But a cover story for what? A good public school education did not warrant risking federal prison and child abuse charges. There had to be an underlying financial motive. As a forensic accountant, I know better than anyone that when people go to extreme lengths to forge a paper trail, there is always a massive payout at the end of it. A state birth certificate is not just a piece of paper. It is the master key to a person's entire legal identity. If they had enough of my personal information to forge a vital government record, they had enough to access every single aspect of my financial life. I quickly helped Lily into the warm bath, making sure she felt safe and comfortable. I grabbed my tablet, put on her favorite cartoon, and set it on the bathroom counter. I told her to relax and play with the bubbles while I went to the other room to do some quick work. I walked out of the bathroom, closed the door halfway, and went straight to my home office. I sat down at my desk, booted up my heavily encrypted work laptop, and immediately logged into the Federal Credit Reporting Bureaus to run a total audit on my own Social Security number. My hands flew across the keyboard. As a forensic accountant, accessing these secure financial databases was second nature. I bypassed the consumer-facing websites and logged directly into the Master Federal Credit Reporting Terminal. I typed in my social security number, hit enter, and waited for the query to resolve. The screen loaded a few seconds later, and the number staring back at me made my stomach drop completely. My pristine credit score of 820, a score I had meticulously built and protected since I was 19 years old, was gone. In its place was a disastrous score of 540. I clicked on the Open Accounts tab, my eyes scanning the raw data with clinical precision even though my heart was pounding furiously against my ribs. There were 3 new credit lines opened within the last 12 months. The first was a premium platinum card from an exclusive high-end department store completely maxed out at $15,000. I pulled up the transaction history. The ledger showed reckless, impulsive charges for designer handbags, expensive imported perfumes, and luxury baby clothes. The second account was a Premier Travel Rewards credit card, sitting at a staggering $25,000 balance. The itemized charges included first-class airline tickets to Cabo San Lucas, thousands of dollars spent at all-inclusive beach resorts, and exorbitant bills from high-end steakhouses. The third was a general spending bank card drained of another $10,000. They had effectively stolen $50,000 of unsecured credit in my name, funding a lavish lifestyle they could never afford on their own. But the unsecured debt was just the appetizer. I scrolled down to the installment loans section, and my breath caught in my throat. There was a massive auto loan issued just 6 months ago for $85,000. I clicked on the lien details to see the vehicle attached to the loan. It was a brand new, fully loaded Cadillac Escalade. It was the exact same black luxury SUV that Terrence drove to every single family gathering. I remembered how he always parked it right in the center of my parents' driveway. I remembered him leaning against the hood, bragging loudly to our father about his incredible new business investments and how well his private consulting firm was doing. He was driving a luxury tank, financed entirely by my stolen identity, playing the role of a successful entrepreneur while using me as his personal bank. My hands were shaking now, not from panic, but from a cold, calculated rage. I opened a new secure browser tab and accessed the state benefits portal. I cross-referenced my social security number with the Public Assistance Registry. The hits came back immediately, confirming my absolute worst fears. According to the state of Illinois, I was a low-income single mother struggling to survive. There were active ongoing claims for food assistance, housing subsidies, and state-sponsored medical care, all legally attached to Lily as my biological dependent. Furthermore, the federal tax transcripts showed they had filed fraudulent tax returns under my name to claim the maximum child tax credits and earned income credits. They had routed all the refund money directly to a digital bank account I did not even recognize. This was not a simple case of a desperate family member borrowing a credit card to buy groceries. This was a highly sophisticated, multi-layered financial crime syndicate operating right out of my sister's living room. They had weaponized my perfectly clean background against me. As a licensed financial professional, a fraud conviction or a ruined credit score would not just hurt my wallet. It would result in the immediate loss of my professional licenses, the end of my entire career, and severe federal prison time. They had tied a concrete block to my feet and thrown me into the ocean, all while using my money to buy the yacht they were currently sailing on. I reached for my yellow legal pad and grabbed my favorite heavy ink pen. I needed to start documenting the fraudulent account numbers, the routing information, and the fake addresses they used. I knew I had to freeze every single account, but if I did it right this second, it might trigger an alert and tip them off before I had all my legal ducks in a row. I needed to build an airtight, bulletproof case before I made my next move. Suddenly, the quiet silence of my apartment was shattered by the sharp, jarring ring of my cell phone sitting on the edge of the desk. I glanced down at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed Terrence. I stared at the phone. It was almost midnight in Chicago, which meant it was late in Cabo, too. There was only one reason he would be calling me right at this exact moment. When criminals set up fraudulent financial accounts, they often link them to their own email addresses or phone numbers to intercept security verifications. By pulling my master credit file, I had triggered an automatic hard inquiry alert on his end. Terrence knew I was looking at the numbers. I let the phone ring twice, took a deep, steadying breath to compose myself, and swiped the green button to answer. The line connected. I did not say hello. I just listened. Instead of the loud club music from my sister's call, I heard the faint sound of ocean waves and the clinking of ice in a glass. Then Terrence's voice came through the speaker. He did not sound panicked or apologetic. He sounded deeply annoyed. He demanded to know why I was triggering security alerts on the credit portal at midnight. I kept my voice deadpan and told him I was just admiring the $85,000 Cadillac Escalade I had apparently purchased for him, along with the $50,000 in luxury vacations and designer clothes. I expected him to backtrack, to make an excuse, or maybe even to beg. But Terrence was a textbook narcissist. He let out a condescending scoff. He told me I had no business snooping around in those accounts, and that I was violating my own family's privacy. I actually let out a dry laugh at the sheer absurdity of his statement. I reminded him that it was my social security number, my name, and my pristine credit history. I told him he had committed massive federal wire fraud and that I was freezing every single account before calling the Chicago Police Department. Terrence's tone instantly shifted from annoyed to menacing. The casual arrogance dropped, replaced by a cold and aggressive edge. He told me I was not going to call the police and I was not going to freeze anything. He said if I made one single move against them, he would make sure I went down right alongside them. I asked him how exactly he planned to do that, considering I had proof I was at work every time a fraudulent transaction was made. That was when he revealed the true depth of their trap. He confidently explained that they had not just opened credit cards. They had submitted extensive applications for state welfare food stamps and housing assistance. He told me they had carefully forged my signature on dozens of physical and digital documents, swearing under penalty of perjury that I was a destitute single mother. He said they even created a digital bank account in my name using my credentials to receive the government funds. He practically hissed into the phone, asking me how I thought the state investigators would look at a wealthy corporate accountant who was siphoning taxpayer welfare money intended for starving children. He said the police would not believe a word I said. They would look at the paperwork, see my perfect forged signature, see my name on the bank accounts, and see the child currently sleeping in my guest bedroom. He promised me that if I blew the whistle, he would testify that I orchestrated the entire scheme to steal government money. He said I would lose my certified public accountant license immediately and serve 10 years in federal prison for defrauding the government. He told me to stop acting like a high and mighty corporate boss. He said I was nothing but a lonely woman who finally had a purpose. He ordered me to be a good little aunt, play nanny for the next 2 weeks, and keep my mouth completely shut. He said if I behaved myself and kept Lily quiet, maybe he would let me drive my Cadillac when they got back from Cabo. He wanted me to break. He expected me to scream, cry, or beg him to clear my name. He was relying entirely on my fear of losing my pristine career and my spotless reputation. He thought he had completely outsmarted me by backing me into a legal corner. But Terrence made one fatal miscalculation. He forgot what I do for a living. I do not just look at numbers. I dismantle complex financial crimes, build airtight legal cases, and testify against sociopaths in federal court. When a suspect starts talking and laying out their entire criminal conspiracy, you do not interrupt them. Without making a sound, I reached over to my work laptop. I opened the encrypted audio software I use to record client dictations and hit the red record button. I made sure the internal microphone was picking up the audio from my phone speaker perfectly. Terrence demanded to know if we had an understanding. I stared at the blinking red recording light on my screen. I forced my breathing to sound shallow and erratic, playing the part of a terrified and defeated woman. I made my voice incredibly small and whispered, "Okay, Terrence, you win. I will play nanny until you get back." He chuckled darkly, called me a smart girl, and ended the call. The revenge plan had officially begun. The next morning, I did not go into the office. I called my managing partner, requested a week of emergency personal time, and immediately went to work fortifying my apartment. I knew Terrence and Courtney were in Cabo, but my parents lived less than 20 minutes away. They were the ground troops in this toxic operation. I needed eyes and ears on everything that happened inside my home. I contacted a private security contractor I frequently collaborated with on corporate espionage cases. Within 2 hours, he delivered a discreet package to my lobby. It contained 4 state-of-the-art hidden cameras with 4K resolution and highly sensitive multidirectional audio receivers. I installed one inside the smoke detector in the living room, giving me a perfect wide-angle view of the main seating area. I hid another inside a decorative digital clock on the kitchen island, positioned directly over the spot where I usually kept my mail and keys. I placed the last 2 near the front door and the hallway leading to the guest bedroom. I synced everything to a secure cloud server on my encrypted tablet. My apartment was no longer just a sanctuary. It was a fully operational surveillance fortress, and I was ready for whatever my family threw at me next. I did not have to wait long. Just after lunch, the loud buzz of my intercom echoed through the quiet apartment. I checked the video feed on my tablet. It was my mother, Patricia. She did not call or text ahead of time. She simply expected to be let in. I took a deep breath, pasted a look of anxious exhaustion onto my face, and buzzed her up. When I opened the door, Patricia pushed right past me without a single word of greeting. She was wearing her pristine tennis outfit and carrying her oversized designer handbag. She immediately began walking through my living space, her sharp eyes scanning every surface like a health inspector looking for a violation. She loudly announced that she was just dropping by to make sure I had not completely ruined Lily's routine. I told her Lily was in the guest room taking a nap after watching a movie. Patricia nodded dismissively and wandered into the kitchen. I watched her from the hallway as she casually leaned against the island right in front of the hidden clock camera. She began shifting through the small stack of mail I had intentionally left on the counter. She was looking for bank statements or notices from the state welfare department. She wanted to see if her threats were keeping me in line. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, acting completely oblivious to her snooping. Patricia casually tossed a junk mail flyer aside and turned to look at me with a condescending smile. She said, "You look terrible, Natalie. You really need to start taking better care of yourself if you are going to handle the responsibilities of motherhood." I tightly gripped the edge of the counter and told her I did not ask for the responsibilities of motherhood, especially not through federal identity theft. Patricia rolled her eyes, let out a dramatic sigh, and leaned closer to me. Her voice dripped with that familiar toxic sweetness she always used when she was trying to manipulate someone. She told me I was looking at this entire situation completely wrong. She said, "You are 32 years old and single. You are so utterly obsessed with your corporate job and your spreadsheets that you have completely failed to find a husband. You should be down on your knees thanking Courtney and Terrence. They essentially gave you a child to love. They gave you a family because they knew you were never going to build one on your own. You get to play house without any of the actual heavy lifting. You should be deeply grateful instead of acting like such a selfish, ungrateful brat." It took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to throw my glass of water right in her face. But I remembered the blinking red light inside the digital clock just inches away from her hand. Every single toxic word, every admission of their twisted scheme was being recorded in crystal clear audio. I lowered my head, feigning total submission, and told her she was right. I told her I was just overwhelmed, but I would handle it. Satisfied that she had successfully beaten me down, Patricia patted my cheek patronizingly. She grabbed her designer handbag from the counter, told me not to feed Lily too much sugar, and strutted out the front door. I locked the deadbolt behind her and let out a long, shaky breath. I walked back into the kitchen to clean up the mess she made of my mail. As I gathered the envelopes, I noticed a thick cream-colored envelope lying on the floor near the bar stool. Patricia must have accidentally pulled it out of her own oversized purse when she was aggressively rummaging around. I picked it up and flipped it over. It was unopened. The return address in the top left corner stopped my heart completely. It was not a bill or a country club invitation. It was a formal letter from Vanguard Heritage and Trust, one of the most prestigious and ruthless wealth management law firms in downtown Chicago. I stared at the thick embossed logo of Vanguard Heritage and Trust. This was the exact firm that had handled my late grandfather's massive estate 7 years ago. My grandfather was a shrewd businessman who built a highly successful real estate empire from the ground up. When he passed away, the family was furious to learn that the majority of his liquid assets were locked away in various blind trusts, completely unavailable to his greedy children. My mother had complained bitterly about his financial decisions for years. Now, one of those elite wealth management trusts was sending a letter directly to my apartment, but it had my mother's desperate fingerprints all over it. I took the envelope into the kitchen and held it over the steam of my boiling electric kettle. The thick adhesive slowly melted, allowing me to carefully pry open the flap without tearing the expensive paper. I pulled out the heavy parchment documents and unfolded them on the granite counter. The header read, "The Harrison Generational Wealth Trust." Below it, my full legal name was printed as the primary fiduciary and legal mother of the sole beneficiary, Lily. I read through the densely worded legal jargon, my forensic accounting background translating the complex clauses instantly. My grandfather had set up an ironclad trust fund, specifically designated for his very first great-grandchild. The principal amount sitting in the investment account was a staggering $4.5 million. But my grandfather was not a fool. He knew his family was financially reckless and deeply manipulative. He specifically structured the trust so that the parents of the great-grandchild could not simply liquidate the account and run away with the cash. The document explicitly stated that the trust would remain completely dormant until the child reached the age of 6. Upon the child's 6th birthday, the designated legal mother would be granted full trustee access to begin withdrawing substantial monthly disbursements for the child's education, housing, and general welfare. I glanced at the calendar hanging on my kitchen wall. Lily had celebrated her 6th birthday exactly 5 weeks ago. The timeline was so perfectly calculated, it made me physically sick to my stomach. But a massive glaring question still burned in my mind. Why would my family go through the extreme, highly illegal trouble of forging a state birth certificate and stealing my identity? If Courtney was the biological mother, she should have been the natural trustee. Why risk federal prison just to put my name on the paperwork when the money was destined for Lily anyway? I left the kitchen and practically sprinted back to my home office. I sat down at my laptop and bypassed the credit bureaus. This time I logged directly into the state and federal criminal database networks. I had high-level access to these systems to run background checks on corporate executives during major corporate mergers. I typed in my sister Courtney's name, her date of birth, and her social security number. I hit search and watched the progress bar load across the screen. The results populated a few seconds later, and the final puzzle piece locked violently into place. They're buried under a sealed record that my parents must have spent a fortune trying to hide, was a felony conviction from 7 years ago. Courtney had been arrested and convicted for possession of a controlled substance with the intent to distribute. It was a severe felony drug charge. I pulled up the Vanguard Heritage and Trust corporate policies on my other monitor. Like all elite wealth management firms, Vanguard required a rigorous federal background check for anyone appointed as a fiduciary or trustee over a multi-million-dollar account. The policy was explicitly clear. Any individual with a felony conviction, especially one related to drugs or financial crimes, was permanently barred from managing trust assets. If Courtney had applied as Lily's mother, Vanguard would have immediately rejected her application. The trust would have been frozen indefinitely, and a state-appointed lawyer would have taken control of the money, leaving Courtney and Terrence with absolutely nothing. They needed a clean proxy. They needed someone with an immaculate legal record, a high-level corporate background, and a spotless financial history to easily pass the ruthless Vanguard vetting process. I was not just a convenient scapegoat for them to dump their bad credit on. I was their golden ticket. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the $4.5 million figure glowing on my screen. The luxury vacations, the $85,000 Cadillac, the designer clothes, all of it was just bridge financing. They were using the stolen credit cards to live like royalty right now, fully expecting to pay off all the massive debt the second the Vanguard Trust began dispersing the monthly payouts into the fraudulent bank accounts they had set up in my name. They were not just stealing my identity to get a child into a good school. They were using me as a completely blind vessel to steal $4.5 million. I did not sleep that night. I spent hours printing out every single piece of evidence, every forged document, and every fraudulent bank statement. By the time the sun came up over the Chicago skyline, I had compiled a perfectly organized legal binder. I knew I needed a lawyer, but not just any lawyer. I needed a shark. I needed someone who specialized in both aggressive family law and complex estate litigation. Through my corporate firm, I had a contact. His name was David Thorne, a ruthless attorney known for tearing apart fraudulent trustees in high-stakes wealth disputes. I called his private office at exactly 8 in the morning, told his paralegal it was an emergency involving a $4 million Vanguard trust, and was sitting across from his massive mahogany desk by 10. David was a sharp, intimidating man in a tailored suit. He did not offer me coffee or make small talk. He just asked to see the file. I slid the heavy binder across the desk. I watched him quietly as he flipped through the pages. He examined the forged birth certificate, read the transcript of Terrence threatening me, looked at the photos of Lily's bruised arm, and finally read the Vanguard trust letter and Courtney's felony record. The silence in the room was heavy. I expected him to tell me how much trouble I was in. Instead, David closed the binder, leaned back in his leather chair, and let out a cold, predatory laugh. He looked at me with absolute professional admiration. He said, "Natalie, your family is not just greedy. They are incredibly, undeniably stupid." I asked him to explain. David leaned forward and rested his elbows on the desk. He told me that by forging a state-issued birth certificate and filing it with multiple government agencies to bypass Courtney's felony record, they did not just steal my identity. They legally made me Lily's mother in the eyes of the law. He explained that if Courtney and Terrence wanted to legally reverse this, they would have to walk into a federal courtroom and confess to multiple counts of felony identity theft, wire fraud, and perjury. They would be sending themselves straight to federal prison. Therefore, they are entirely trapped by their own criminal paperwork. David tapped the Vanguard letter with his expensive pen. He said, because of this legal standing, you hold absolutely all the power. You do not just have the right to claim full physical custody of that child to protect her from that abusive household. You have the total uncontested legal right to control the $4.5 million trust fund. The money belongs to Lily, but the law states only you can manage it. They have effectively handed you the keys to the castle while locking themselves in the dungeon. I felt a massive wave of relief wash over me, but David held up his hand to stop me. He told me the war was not over yet. He said Terrence and Courtney are broke, maxed out, and heavily in debt because of the bridge loans they took out in your name. They need that Vanguard money desperately to avoid completely defaulting on everything, but they have a massive problem. Vanguard will not release a single penny of that trust without the verified notarized signature of the legal mother. That means they need you. I told him Terrence had threatened to frame me for welfare fraud if I did not cooperate. David scoffed and said the welfare fraud is a scare tactic. They know if they turn you in, the whole house of cards collapses and Vanguard freezes the account forever. They cannot afford to destroy you until they get the money out of that trust account first. They are going to play nice, or they are going to try to bully you. But their ultimate goal is to get your signature on a very specific legal document. David pulled a blank legal form from his drawer and slid it toward me. It was a full power of attorney and trustee transfer agreement. He looked me dead in the eye, his voice dropping to a deadly serious whisper. He warned me that they will try to force you to sign a power of attorney to take the money. He said they will likely ambush you when you are surrounded by family trying to use guilt and intimidation to make you sign away your rights. He said you cannot let them get that signature. If you sign this paper in permanent ink, they take the $4 million, they take the child back to that abusive home, and they leave you with massive credit card debt and a ruined career. You have to outsmart them at their own game. David told me I had to play the part of the defeated submissive sister perfectly. I needed to act like their threats had completely broken my spirit. He instructed me to go back to my apartment, care for Lily, and wait for their trap to spring. I asked him what I should do when they inevitably put the paperwork in front of me. David smiled a sharp, dangerous smile. He told me to sign it, but to make sure the signature never actually mattered. I walked out of his office with a concrete plan, my mind already calculating the perfect counterstrike. I walked out of his office with a concrete plan, my mind already calculating the perfect counterstrike. Thanksgiving was exactly 2 days away. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text message from Courtney. She and Terrence had just landed back in Chicago from their luxurious Cabo vacation. Her message was short, commanding, and completely devoid of any gratitude. She told me to bring Lily to Mom and Dad's house for Thanksgiving dinner at 4 o'clock sharp, and she reminded me to keep my mouth shut if I knew what was good for me. I stared at the screen, letting the familiar sting of her arrogance wash over me, but this time it did not hurt. This time it fueled me. I typed back a simple single-word response. Okay. I made sure to add no punctuation conveying the exact tone of a sister who had completely given up the fight. My next stop was not the grocery store for a turkey. It was a specialty surveillance and tactical supply shop located on the north side of the city. As a forensic accountant, I had seen fraudsters use all sorts of tricks to alter physical documents, but I needed something incredibly specific. I walked up to the glass counter and asked the clerk for a high-thermal disappearing ink pen. He pulled out a sleek, professional-looking black fountain pen. He explained that the ink contained a volatile chemical compound. When you write with it, the ink appears deep blue, completely indistinguishable from standard legal ink. But within exactly 24 hours, the chemical composition breaks down from exposure to the air and the ink evaporates completely. It leaves absolutely no residue, no indents, and no trace that it was ever on the paper. I paid $150 for the pen in cash. When I got back to my apartment, I spent an hour testing it on heavy stock legal paper, timing the evaporation process perfectly. By the next morning, the thick blue signatures I had written the night before were completely gone, leaving the pages completely blank. The night before Thanksgiving, I put Lily to bed early. I went into my bathroom, turned on the harsh overhead lights, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. For 32 years, my family had conditioned me to be the scapegoat. They expected me to be weak, anxious, and easily manipulated by their constant guilt trips and threats. If I walked into that dining room looking confident or defiant, Terrence would immediately suspect a trap. I needed to give them exactly the version of Natalie they wanted to see. I practiced dropping my shoulders and hunching my posture to make myself look smaller. I practiced biting my lip and avoiding direct eye contact. I forced tears to well up in my eyes, perfecting the look of a woman who was terrified of losing her career and going to federal prison. I rehearsed my lines, practicing how my voice should shake when I begged them not to ruin my life. It was a sickening performance, but it was absolutely necessary. I had to convince them that their blackmail had completely destroyed my spirit. When Thanksgiving morning finally arrived, I dressed in a plain gray sweater and loose jeans, intentionally looking exhausted and unkempt. I helped Lily into a cute holiday dress and packed her favorite toys into a bag. I made sure my hidden camera brooch, a small, elegant silver pin that housed a tiny 4K lens and a microphone, was securely attached to my sweater collar. I tested the wireless feed to my secure cloud server one last time. The audio was crystal clear. Every single threat, every admission of guilt, and every coercive demand they were about to make would be recorded directly to an encrypted drive. I drove across town toward the affluent suburb where my parents lived. The crisp autumn air outside was sharp, but the atmosphere inside my car was heavy with anticipation. I pulled into my parents' long, winding driveway. Sure enough, parked right in the center, gleaming in the afternoon sun, was the brand-new $85,000 Cadillac Escalade that Terrence had fraudulently financed in my name. Seeing it in person, knowing the massive debt attached to my stolen identity, made my blood run cold. But I took a deep breath, touched the silver brooch on my collar, and patted the invisible ink pen resting securely in my coat pocket. I unbuckled Lily from her car seat and took her small hand in mine. We walked up the manicured brick pathway toward the massive front door. I let go of her hand just long enough to reach out and press the illuminated button. The doorbell rang at my parents' house. The battleground was set. The door swung open before I could even pull my hand back. My mother stood there wearing a forced smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She ushered Lily and me inside, immediately complaining about the cold draft. As we stepped into the grand foyer, the loud booming laugh of my brother-in-law echoed from the formal living room. Courtney strolled out to greet us holding a crystal glass of champagne. She was dressed in a stunning brand-new silk dress. Slung casually over the back of the hallway armchair was a bright red designer handbag. I recognized the brand and the specific model immediately. It was the exact item that had been charged to the maxed-out platinum credit card sitting entirely under my name. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering mockingly on my plain gray sweater. She smirked and told me it was nice of me to put so much effort into dressing up for the holidays. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor and mumbled a quiet apology, playing the part of the defeated sister flawlessly. Terrence walked into the hallway, neck swirling amber liquid in a heavy crystal glass. He wore a tailored suit jacket and a flashy gold watch that I also knew was paid for by my stolen identity. He clapped me hard on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to look friendly, but felt entirely like a physical threat. I felt Lily flinch and hide behind my leg the second Terrence approached. Courtney barely even acknowledged her own daughter, simply telling Lily to go play quietly in the corner so the adults could talk. We moved into the formal dining room where the massive mahogany table was set with fine china and expensive silver. As we took our seats, Terrence immediately took control of the conversation. He loudly bragged to my father about his latest real estate ventures and his private consulting firm. He claimed he had just closed a massive deal in Cabo that would double his financial portfolio by the end of the year. My father, Richard, nodded along with absolute admiration, completely mesmerized by the illusion of extreme wealth. My father praised Terrence for being a true provider and a brilliant businessman, completely ignoring the fact that Terrence had not held a legitimate job in over 3 years. My mother chimed in, pouring more expensive wine into Courtney's glass. She looked across the table at me and let out a dramatic, condescending sigh. She asked me if I was still just crunching boring numbers in a dusty cubicle downtown. She said it was such a terrible shame I never developed the entrepreneurial spirit like Terrence. She told me I should really take notes from his relentless hustle, instead of working a dead-end accounting job that clearly was not paying me enough to buy decent clothes or find a husband. The entire table chuckled at my expense. Terrence smiled at me from across the table, his eyes filled with pure malice, and told my parents not to be too hard on me because someone has to do the boring paperwork for the real bosses of the world. I gripped my cloth napkin tightly under the table, letting a few fake tears well up in my eyes to satisfy their sick need for dominance. I forced my shoulders to slump even further, but inside my head, my forensic accountant brain was laughing hysterically. Terrence's incredible hustle was nothing but a poorly constructed trail of felony wire fraud. I sat there silently eating my side salad, knowing full well that the $85,000 luxury SUV sitting right outside the dining room window legally belonged to me. I knew that the designer bag resting in the hallway was bought with my stolen credit, and that the only reason they were drinking expensive champagne was because they were actively committing federal identity theft. I just nodded, slowly looked down at my plate, and told my mother she was absolutely right. I told them I was just exhausted from the stress of my boring job and the new responsibilities of watching Lily. They ate it up completely. They loved seeing me broken. They spent the next hour talking about their luxurious trip, constantly dropping hints about how much money they were about to come into. Finally, my father stood up at the head of the table to carve the massive golden turkey. He sliced the meat perfectly, handed out the heavy ceramic plates, and then set the sharp carving knife down on the cutting board. The jovial, celebratory atmosphere in the room suddenly vanished. The trap was ready to spring. Richard cleared his throat loudly, reached over to the side buffet table, and pulled out a thick stack of formal legal documents. Richard placed the heavy stack of papers directly next to my plate of uneaten turkey. The crisp white pages stood out starkly against the dark mahogany dining table. I looked down at the bold black lettering printed across the very top page. It read, "Full power of attorney and irrevocable trustee transfer." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, even though I knew exactly what was coming. My father leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach, and put on his best authoritative voice. He told me that since Terrence was such a highly successful financial consultant, the family had decided it would be best if he took over the management of Lily's educational accounts. He casually mentioned that Vanguard required a few simple signatures from me, just to streamline the administrative process, since my name was technically on the initial public school enrollment forms. It was a spectacular brazen lie. They were asking me to sign away total legal and financial control of a $4.5 million trust fund, packaging it as a minor administrative favor between loving family members. Before I could even pretend to read the first paragraph of the dense legal jargon, my mother Patricia jumped right in to seal the trap. She leaned across the table, her eyes wide with manufactured maternal concern. She told me to just sign the papers, Natalie. She said it is just standard paperwork so Terrence can manage Lily's private school funds properly. You do not want to ruin Thanksgiving by being difficult and starting a fight, do you? Her voice was dripping with that familiar toxic sweetness, the exact tone she always used right before she pushed me into doing something that only benefited my sister. Courtney took a long sip of her expensive champagne, rolled her eyes, and let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. She complained to the room that I always had to make everything so incredibly complicated and dramatic. She said, just sign the stupid paper so we can cut the pumpkin pie and actually enjoy the holiday. They were treating a multi-million-dollar legal transfer like it was a permission slip for a middle school field trip. They assumed I was too intimidated to actually read the fine print, or too desperate for their fragile approval to question their absolute authority. I shifted nervously in my seat, acting as though I was severely hesitating. I softly told my father that I really did not feel comfortable signing complex legal documents without having my own lawyer review them first. The moment those words left my mouth, the entire atmosphere in the dining room turned incredibly hostile. The fake, polite smiles vanished instantly. Terrence pushed his heavy wooden chair back forcefully. The legs scraped loudly and aggressively against the hardwood floor. He stood up and walked slowly around the large dining table until he was standing directly behind my chair. I could feel his body heat and smell the expensive cologne he had purchased with my stolen credit card. He placed both of his heavy hands firmly on my shoulders, his grip tightening just enough to send a very clear physical warning. He leaned his upper body down, placing his mouth right next to my ear. His voice dropped to a low, menacing whisper that only I was meant to hear. He reminded me of the fraudulent welfare documents they had already submitted in my name. He told me that if I did not pick up a pen and sign every single page right now, he would make the phone call to the state criminal investigators before the turkey was even cold. He said my accounting career would be completely over by Monday morning. My mother glared at me from across the table, her face hardened into a mask of pure disgust and disappointment. She told me I was being an ungrateful, selfish daughter, and that I owed this to my sister after everything Courtney had sacrificed. I let my shoulders collapse completely under Terrence's heavy, suffocating grip. I forced my breathing to become ragged and shallow. I blinked hard, allowing the tears I had been holding back to finally spill over my eyelashes and roll down my cheeks. I let out a pathetic, defeated sob, making sure the hidden microphone on my silver brooch caught every single sound of my manufactured mental breakdown. I looked up at my family with wide, terrified eyes and told them in a shaky whisper that they had won. I told them I would sign whatever they wanted just to make it stop. With trembling hands, I reached down into my leather purse, sitting by my feet, my fingers brushing past my wallet until they wrapped tightly around the sleek black barrel of the disappearing ink pen. I grasped the smooth, cold barrel of the black fountain pen hidden deep inside my bag. It felt incredibly heavy in my hand, almost like a loaded weapon disguised as a simple office tool. I slowly pulled my hand out of my leather purse and brought the pen up to the edge of the table. My hands were intentionally shaking so violently that I actually dropped the pen onto the polished mahogany wood. It clattered loudly, breaking the tense silence of the dining room. Terrence let out a frustrated, angry sigh, his heavy grip tightening painfully on my shoulder. I whispered a pathetic apology, picked the pen back up, and carefully uncapped it. I stared down at the dense legal paragraphs of the Vanguard Trust transfer document. To anyone else in the room, I looked like a completely broken woman surrendering her entire life and financial future to her abusers. But behind my tear-filled eyes, my mind was sharp cold and entirely focused on the flawless execution of my trap. I pressed the metal nib of the specialty pen against the thick white legal paper. The chemical ink flowed beautifully, leaving a dark, rich blue signature right on the designated dotted line. It looked incredibly authentic and completely permanent. I moved to the second page, then the third, signing away my supposed rights as Lily's legal guardian and sole trustee. With every stroke of the pen, I let out a quiet, trembling sob. I even allowed a single heavy tear to fall from my cheek and hit the bottom corner of the fourth page, slightly smudging the printed date. It was the perfect touch of theatrical authenticity. A forensic document examiner would look at that teardrop stain and see the undeniable physical evidence of severe emotional distress. But my family just saw weakness. They watched me sign away $4.5 million with absolute glee. I reached the final page, the irrevocable transfer of trustee rights, and slowly wrote my name one last time. The second the tip of the pen lifted from the final page, Courtney lunged forward across the dining table like a starving animal. She practically ripped the thick stack of papers right out from under my hands. She quickly flipped through the pages, her greedy eyes scanning the bold blue signatures to make sure I had not missed a single required line or initial box. When she saw that every section was perfectly filled out, a massive triumphant grin spread across her face. She let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed through the quiet room. She looked at my tear-stained face, rolled her eyes in sheer disgust, and told me, "God, you are always such an unbearable drama queen." She tapped the stack of papers against the table to straighten them, clutched them to her chest, and smirked right at me. She literally looked me in the eyes and said, "Thanks for the cash, sis." Terrence finally released his suffocating grip on my shoulders. He stood up straight, adjusted the lapels of his expensive suit jacket, and gave my shoulder two firm, incredibly condescending pats. It was the exact kind of degrading pat you would give to an obedient dog that had just performed a trick. He walked back around the large dining table and took his seat next to my sister. He picked up his crystal glass of champagne, raised it high in the air toward my father in a mocking toast, and took a long, arrogant sip. He looked over at me with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. He told me that was not so hard, was it? He promised me that as long as I kept playing my role and kept my mouth shut, they would not have to ruin my little accounting career. My parents completely validated the abuse by ignoring my crying entirely. My father simply picked up his carving knife again and happily asked who wanted the dark meat. They went right back to their lavish Thanksgiving dinner, completely energized by the fact that they had just stolen millions of dollars through pure extortion. They thought they had won the ultimate victory. They believed they had successfully weaponized my fear against me and secured their fraudulent luxury lifestyle forever. But they were completely oblivious to the small, elegant silver brooch pinned securely to the collar of my gray sweater. They had absolutely no idea that the tiny state-of-the-art 4K lens hidden inside the jewelry had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire dining table. They did not know that the highly sensitive multi-directional microphone had captured every single agonizing second of their crime. It recorded Terrence threatening me with fake welfare fraud and prison time. It recorded Courtney explicitly thanking me for the cash. They thought they had legally trapped me with a pen and paper, but all they had really done was hand me a flawless high-definition video confession to multiple federal felonies. 24 hours later, I was back in the quiet sanctuary of my downtown corporate office. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Black Friday. While the rest of the city was bustling with holiday shopping, I was sitting perfectly still at my desk, staring intently at my cell phone resting right next to my keyboard. The chemical composition of the specialized disappearing ink I had purchased was rigorously designed to evaporate within a strict 24-hour window. I had timed it down to the exact minute. I knew precisely where my sister and her husband were right at that moment. They had booked a highly anticipated private meeting at the Vanguard Heritage and Trust corporate banking branch to officially submit the transfer documents and claim the $4.5 million. I had already spent my morning backing up the devastating Thanksgiving video and audio recordings to 3 separate encrypted hard drives. My estate attorney David Thorne had reviewed the high-definition footage of them extorting me and confirmed we had absolutely everything we needed to bury them in federal court. Now it was just a matter of waiting for the other shoe to drop. The silence in my office felt electric. Suddenly, my phone screen lit up brightly, vibrating violently against the wooden desk. The caller ID flashed my sister Courtney's name. I did not reach for it. I simply sat back in my ergonomic chair, crossed my arms, and let it ring. It rang 5 consecutive times before finally rolling over to voicemail. Less than a minute later, the digital notification pinged, signaling a new recorded message. I casually reached into my desk drawer, pulled out my wireless earbuds, placed them securely in my ears, and pressed play. Courtney's voice was not just angry, it was completely unhinged. She was screaming so loudly and with such intense ferocity that the audio actually peaked and distorted the tiny speakers in my ears. Through her hysterical, breathy shrieking, I could easily piece together the glorious catastrophe that had just unfolded inside the bank manager's pristine office. She demanded to know what kind of sick, twisted game I was playing. She screamed that they had walked into the Vanguard branch, sat down with the senior trust director, and confidently slid the thick folder of legal transfer documents across the mahogany desk. They were practically salivating, completely ready to walk out as multimillionaires. But when the senior director opened the heavy leather folder to officially verify and notarize my signatures, he found absolutely nothing. The pages were entirely blank. The rich blue ink I had sobbed over the day before had completely evaporated, leaving behind crisp, untouched white paper with zero trace that a pen had ever graced the surface. Courtney shrieked on the voicemail that the trust director had looked at them like they were completely insane. Terrence had apparently lost his temper, slamming his fist on the desk and aggressively claiming I had just signed the papers in front of his own eyes the night before. But Vanguard does not tolerate volatile behavior, especially not when it comes to highly secure multi-million-dollar trust accounts. The bank director calmly informed them that presenting blank legal documents while attempting to gain access to a secured fiduciary fund was highly irregular and deeply suspicious. Courtney sobbed violently into the phone, screaming that the bank director had actually threatened to hit the silent alarm and call the armed security guards if they did not leave the premises immediately. They were escorted out of the building in front of the entire bank, staff humiliated, entirely broke, and completely empty-handed. Courtney ended the frantic voicemail by declaring that I had ruined her entire life and that she was going to make me pay for humiliating them. I pulled the earbuds out, a genuine wide smile spreading across my face for the first time in weeks. Their flawless master plan had completely disintegrated into thin air, exactly like the ink on those pages. They had walked into one of the most prestigious financial institutions in the country, trying to cash a blank check, and got thrown out like common criminals. I picked up my coffee mug, feeling an overwhelming sense of vindication. But my moment of quiet triumph was abruptly cut short. The screen of my phone lit up again, this time with a direct text message notification. It was from Terrence. He was not prone to hysterical screaming like my sister. He was a cold, calculating narcissist, and his message completely bypassed any lingering pretense of family loyalty. It was short, brutal, and terrifyingly clear. I opened the message and read the words carefully. It simply read, "You are dead. We are calling Child Protective Services right now to tell them you kidnapped and severely abused our daughter." I stared at the threatening text message illuminating my phone screen. Terrence was not bluffing. Calling Child Protective Services to falsely accuse a family member of kidnapping and abuse was the ultimate scorched earth tactic. It was a vicious, calculated move designed to weaponize the state government against me. They figured that if CPS agents stormed into my home and ripped Lily out of my arms, I would be so completely devastated and terrified that I would sign over the trust fund just to get her back. They wanted to trigger an emergency removal order, tossing a traumatized 6-year-old girl into the chaotic foster care system right before the holidays, all to cover their own massive financial crimes. I did not waste a single second. I locked my computer screen, grabbed my heavy winter coat, and walked swiftly out of my office. I flagged down my managing partner in the hallway and calmly informed him that I had a severe family emergency requiring my immediate attention. Because of my flawless track record at the firm, he did not ask any questions. He simply nodded and told me to handle my business. I took the elevator down to the parking garage and climbed into my car. The drive back to my apartment felt like a high-speed blur. My mind was operating at maximum capacity, running through every possible legal scenario and preparing my counter-arguments. I knew exactly how CPS investigations worked. They operate on the element of surprise. They want to catch the accused abuser completely off guard, storming into a chaotic environment to look for any signs of neglect, drug use, or physical danger. I had to make sure my home looked like the absolute safest, most stable environment on the entire planet. I pulled into my building and took the private elevator up to my floor. When I unlocked my front door, the apartment was quiet and peaceful. Because it was Black Friday and school was closed for the holiday weekend, I had hired a highly recommended background-checked professional nanny from an elite agency to watch Lily while I was at the office. I walked into the living room and found Lily happily sitting on the plush rug, building a massive castle out of colorful plastic blocks. The nanny was sitting nearby reading a book. I thanked the nanny for her exceptional help, paid her generously in cash, and locked the door behind her. I knelt down next to Lily and gave her a warm, reassuring smile. I told her she was doing a beautiful job with her castle. I kept my voice incredibly soft and steady, completely hiding the intense adrenaline pumping through my veins. I explained to her that some people from the city might be coming over to visit us very soon. I told her they were just community helpers coming to make sure we had a nice, safe home. I promised her that no matter what happened or what anyone said, she was not in any trouble and she was never going to leave my side. Lily nodded her small head, trusting me implicitly. With Lily safely occupied in the living room, I moved swiftly into the kitchen to prepare the ultimate battlefield. I cleared off the massive granite island, wiping it down until it shined perfectly. I walked into my home office, opened my heavy steel fireproof safe, and pulled out the 3 massive, meticulously organized evidence binders I had prepared. I carried them back into the kitchen and laid them out in a perfect, intimidating row across the granite counter. The first binder contained every single forged state document, including the fake birth certificate naming me as the biological mother. The second binder held the complete financial audit, detailing the $85,000 Cadillac, the maxed-out credit cards, and the fraudulent welfare applications. The third binder contained the protective custody paperwork drafted by my estate attorney, establishing my absolute legal right to keep the child safe from her biological abusers. Finally, I placed my encrypted tablet right in the center of the binders, queuing up the high-definition video footage of Terrence violently threatening me at the Thanksgiving dinner table. My apartment was absolutely spotless. The refrigerator was fully stocked with healthy food. Lily's temporary bedroom was beautifully decorated and filled with new clothes and toys. I had systematically removed any possible angle they could use against me. I poured myself a glass of cold water, sat down on the tall leather bar stool at the kitchen island, and waited for the storm to arrive. I did not have to wait very long. Exactly 45 minutes after Terrence sent that text message, the heavy silence of my apartment was violently shattered. A loud, aggressive, and authoritative knock echoed through my heavy wooden front door. It was the unmistakable sound of state authorities. Child Protective Services had arrived, and based on the heavy footsteps echoing in the hallway, they were accompanied by at least 2 armed police officers. I stood up from the bar stool, smoothed down the front of my gray sweater, and walked deliberately toward the front door. I did not rush and I did not hesitate. When you are accused of acting erratically, the most powerful defense is absolute unwavering composure. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt, turned the handle, and pulled the door wide open. Standing in my hallway was a stern-looking woman in a sharp navy blazer, holding a thick metal clipboard. Flanking her on either side were 2 uniformed Chicago police officers. Their hands were resting cautiously near their utility belts, clearly briefed by dispatch to expect a highly volatile and potentially dangerous situation. They expected to find a hysterical, deranged woman barricaded inside a messy apartment with a screaming, terrified child. Instead, they found me. I stood tall, offered a polite, completely serene smile, and calmly asked how I could help them this afternoon. The woman stepped forward, her eyes darting past me to quickly scan the entryway for any immediate threats. She introduced herself as Agent Mitchell from the Department of Children and Family Services. She stated with a rigid tone that they had received an urgent, high-priority tip regarding a potential child abduction and severe physical abuse occurring at this exact address. She asked if they could step inside immediately to conduct a mandatory welfare check on a 6-year-old girl named Lily. I did not act offended, and I certainly did not try to block the doorway. I simply stepped back, opened the door entirely, and graciously invited them into my home. The officers stepped in first, their eyes sweeping the large room for any signs of a struggle. What they saw immediately diffused the physical tension in their broad shoulders. My apartment was immaculate, flooded with natural light from the large windows, and completely peaceful. In the center of the plush living room rug sat Lily, happily humming a popular cartoon theme song while meticulously snapping colorful plastic blocks together to finish her toy castle. She looked up when the heavy boots of the officers entered the room, gave them a shy but genuine smile, and went right back to playing. There were no tears, no signs of distress, and absolutely no indication of fear in her body language. Agent Mitchell looked visibly confused. The chaotic hostage situation she had been prepped for simply did not exist. I kept my voice low and soothing, asking the officers if they would like a bottle of cold water while we sorted out whatever massive misunderstanding had prompted their visit. One officer politely declined, but his hand completely moved away from his weapon. Agent Mitchell cleared her throat, attempting to regain her authoritative posture after being thrown off balance by the calm environment. She asked if we could speak privately in the other room away from the child's ears. I nodded and led her and the lead officer into the kitchen, stopping right next to the massive granite island where my 3 heavy evidence binders were waiting in a perfect row. Agent Mitchell looked at the meticulously organized binders and then looked at me. She kept her voice firm, stating that the tip they received was incredibly specific and deeply concerning. She explained that the biological parents who claimed to be currently vacationing out of the country called the emergency hotline just an hour ago in a total panic. They reported that I was a severely unstable, childless woman who had grown dangerously obsessed with their daughter. They alleged that I had exploited their brief absence, unlawfully removed Lily from her elementary school without any legal authorization, and was currently holding her captive. Furthermore, they explicitly claimed that I had a documented history of violent mental outbursts and that Lily was in immediate danger of severe physical abuse if they did not intervene today. I listened to every single word of their fabricated story without interrupting. I did not gasp, I did not cry, and I did not passionately defend my character. I knew that reacting emotionally is exactly what guilty or unstable people do when confronted by law enforcement. Instead, I let out a soft, almost pitying sigh. I told Agent Mitchell that I completely understood why she had to investigate such a terrifying claim. I commended her for acting so quickly to protect a vulnerable child. Then I offered a tight, incredibly sharp smile. I gestured toward the tall leather bar stools surrounding the kitchen island and politely asked Agent Mitchell and the police officer to please sit down. They exchanged a brief, bewildered glance before slowly taking their seats. I stood on the opposite side of the counter, resting my hands firmly on the heavy black cover of the first binder. I told them that the people who called in that tip were indeed dangerous criminals, but not for the reasons they claimed over the phone. I flipped open the thick cover of the binder. I bypassed the school pickup forms and the fraudulent welfare applications. I went straight to the very first plastic sleeve. I carefully pulled out the heavy state-issued document featuring the official embossed government seal. I placed my fingertips on the edge of the thick paper and slid the official mother's copy of the legal birth certificate across the polished granite table directly into the hands of the CPS agent. Agent Mitchell picked up the heavy, embossed paper. Her eyes scanned the raised government seal and then dropped to the bold print listing me as the biological mother. She looked up, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. She stated that this document contradicted the emergency tip they had just received. The caller specifically claimed I was a childless aunt who had violently abducted her niece. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool granite counter. I told her the people who called in that tip were my sister Courtney and her husband Terrence. I explained that they were not calling out of parental concern. They were calling out of sheer panicked desperation because their multi-million-dollar extortion plot had just spectacularly collapsed less than 2 hours ago. I opened the first binder and began laying out the timeline. I did not sound angry. I sounded like a forensic accountant presenting a flawless audit to a board of directors. I walked Agent Mitchell and the police officers through the hospital records. I showed them the admission forms where Courtney had used my stolen identification card and social security number the day Lily was born. I explained the exact motive behind this elaborate deception. I pulled out the sealed court records proving Courtney had a severe felony drug conviction on her record. I then presented the formal trust documents from Vanguard Heritage and Trust explicitly showing that a $4.5 million inheritance was locked away entirely inaccessible to anyone with a felony record. They needed my pristine legal identity to serve as a clean vessel to bypass the federal background checks. The lead police officer leaned over the counter, his eyes wide as he absorbed the magnitude of the fraud. He asked how they managed to afford a luxury vacation in Cabo if they were completely broke and waiting for the trust fund to disperse. That was my cue to open the second binder. I flipped to the financial section. I slid the itemized credit reports across the island. I pointed directly to the $85,000 auto loan for the Cadillac Escalade parked right outside my parents' house. I showed them the maxed-out platinum credit cards used to buy designer clothes and first-class plane tickets. I explained that they had stolen $50,000 of unsecured credit in my name to fund a lavish lifestyle, intending to use the trust fund money to pay it all off once they forced me to sign over the rights. But the financial devastation was not what caught Agent Mitchell's attention the most. I turned to the next tab and pulled out the physical copies of the state welfare applications. I showed the CPS agent how Terrence and Courtney had forged my signature under penalty of perjury, claiming I was a destitute single mother. They had been actively siphoning taxpayer money, food stamps, and housing subsidies into a fraudulent digital bank account while simultaneously sipping expensive champagne in Cabo. The officers exchanged a dark, serious look. This was no longer just a family dispute over a child. This was massive systemic fraud against the federal government. Agent Mitchell shook her head, her face pale. She said this financial evidence is overwhelming, but her primary jurisdiction was the physical safety of the child. She asked me directly about the allegations of abuse. She needed to know why Lily was seemingly terrified of her own parents. I nodded slowly, feeling a deep ache in my chest for what my niece had endured. I told them that the financial crimes were only half the story. The physical and psychological abuse they inflicted on Lily to maintain this elaborate cover story was far worse. I reached for my encrypted tablet sitting in the center of the binders. I unlocked the screen and opened the secure audio files. I told Agent Mitchell to listen very closely to the recording I had taken just 2 nights ago. I pressed play. The high-definition audio of Terrence's voice filled my quiet kitchen. The officers heard him violently threatening me. They heard him explicitly state that if I did not sign the trust over to them, he would frame me for the welfare fraud they committed and ensure I went to federal prison. Then I played the second recording. It was the heartbreaking audio of Lily sitting in my bathtub crying and begging me not to tell Terrence. The room went completely silent as the small, terrified voice of a 6-year-old girl echoed from the speakers. Lily described the sick coaching sessions. She explained how Terrence would grab her by the arm, leaving dark bruises, and scream at her to call me her mother. She told the recording that Terrence threatened to have the police lock her in a dark cage forever if she ever told the teachers the truth. I turned off the tablet and looked right at the state authorities. I told them I did not kidnap Lily. I rescued her. I explained that Terrence and Courtney were perfectly willing to destroy a child's mind and weaponize the foster care system just to get their hands on $4 million. Agent Mitchell sat frozen in her tall bar stool, completely horrified by the pure malice she had just witnessed. She slowly closed the heavy evidence binder and looked up at the 2 police officers standing beside her. Their entire demeanor had shifted. The aggressive suspicion was gone, replaced by a cold, furious determination. I was no longer a suspect under investigation. I was now the primary key witness to a massive federal crime syndicate. Agent Mitchell closed the heavy binder, took a deep, shaky breath, and looked down the hallway toward the living room. She lowered her voice and told me that investigating federal financial crimes was completely outside of her department, but the physical safety and psychological well-being of the child was her absolute, immediate jurisdiction. She said she needed to speak with Lily privately right now. She assured me she had years of experience conducting forensic interviews with young trauma victims and promised she would not frighten her. I nodded, trusting the dramatic shift in her professional demeanor, and led her down the hall. Lily was still sitting on the plush living room rug, carefully placing a bright yellow plastic block on top of her tall tower. Agent Mitchell did not loom over her with a metal clipboard or act like an interrogator. She took off her sharp navy blazer, draped it casually over the armchair, and sat cross-legged right on the floor next to Lily. She picked up a stray plastic block and softly asked if she could help build the castle. Lily smiled shyly and handed her a green piece. I stepped back into the hallway, with the 2 police officers giving them plenty of space, but keeping a very close watch. I listened as Agent Mitchell gently guided the conversation from favorite morning cartoons to school, and eventually to her daily life at home with Courtney and Terrence. Lily hesitated at first, her small eyes darting nervously toward my heavy front door. But sitting in my quiet, secure apartment miles away from the chaotic screaming and aggressive behavior of her parents, she finally felt safe enough to tell the truth. In her small, innocent voice, she told the state investigator absolutely everything. She explained how Terrence would grab her arms violently and shake her when she messed up her daily coaching drills. She described the dark, fading bruises I had found during her bath. She cried softly as she told Agent Mitchell about the dark cage Terrence promised to lock her in forever if she ever told the police about the fake paperwork game they played. The two police officers standing next to me in the hallway immediately tensed up. One of them clenched his jaw so hard I could actually hear his teeth grinding together. Hearing a 6-year-old describe severe psychological torture and physical abuse firsthand changes the entire atmosphere of a room. Agent Mitchell did not push Lily for more gruesome details. She simply thanked her for being so incredibly brave, promised her that she was not in any trouble, and gave her a warm, comforting hug. Agent Mitchell stood up, brushed off her dark pants, and walked back into the kitchen with me. The professional, detached composure she had maintained when she first arrived was visibly cracking. She looked me directly in the eyes and stated that my sister and brother-in-law were extremely dangerous individuals. She confirmed that the physical abuse and psychological conditioning were severe enough to warrant an immediate removal from their custody. But then her expression turned incredibly serious. She placed her hands flat on the cool granite counter and explained the harsh, terrifying legal reality of our current situation. She told me that because Terrence and Courtney had successfully forged the state birth certificate and registered it with multiple federal government agencies, I was technically the sole legal guardian recognized by the state of Illinois. She said if I officially contested the birth certificate right now to clear my name of the financial fraud, I would instantly legally sever my ties to Lily. If I did that, the child would have no recognized legal guardian present in the state. Agent Mitchell's voice broke slightly as she delivered the final blow. She said if you renounce your status as her mother tonight, state law mandates that I place Lily into emergency foster care immediately. She will sleep in a group home tonight surrounded by strangers, and we will have to fight your family in a prolonged court battle to keep them from getting her back. The thought of Lily being ripped from my safe home and thrown into the chaotic, terrifying foster care system made my blood run entirely cold. My family had built this massive, fraudulent trap to destroy me and steal millions. But I suddenly realized I could use their own fake paperwork as an impenetrable legal shield to protect my niece. I did not even have to think about my answer. I looked at Agent Mitchell and told her to draft the emergency paperwork right now. I told her I would take full responsibility for the child under the identity my family had illegally created. Agent Mitchell quickly pulled a thick stack of forms from her leather briefcase and laid them out next to my evidence binders. She explained that this emergency protective order would grant me full physical custody and legally bar Terrence and Courtney from coming anywhere near my property or the child. I picked up my favorite heavy ink pen, the real one this time, and firmly signed my name on the bottom line. I handed the paperwork back to the state investigator, looked her dead in the eyes, and told her she stays with me. They will never touch her again. Agent Mitchell and the police officers left my apartment late Friday evening with the signed emergency protective order securely in her briefcase. For the first time in her life, Lily slept soundly through the night in a home where she was entirely safe from fear and manipulation. I sat awake at my kitchen island drinking black coffee and watching the sun rise over the Chicago skyline. Securing my niece was the most important victory, but my family still believed they could use my stolen financial identity to maintain their fraudulent luxury lifestyle. It was time to systematically dismantle every single asset they had acquired using my name. I opened my laptop and pulled up the $85,000 auto loan for the Cadillac Escalade. Because Courtney and Terrence had foolishly put the vehicle registration entirely under my name. To secure the low interest rate, I was the sole legal owner of the luxury SUV. I did not need a court order or a police escort to take it back. I simply needed a tow truck. I searched online and found a highly rated no-nonsense private asset recovery and towing company located just a few miles from their luxury apartment complex. I called the dispatch number, explained that I needed an immediate vehicular recovery of my own property, and emailed them the digital title, and my state identification. The dispatcher verified my ownership and promised a flatbed truck would be at the location within the hour. I wanted to witness this specific moment with my own two eyes. I called the Elite Nanny Service and requested emergency weekend coverage. Once the nanny arrived and Lily was happily eating breakfast, I grabbed my keys and drove across town. I parked my unassuming sedan across the street from the premium resident parking lot of Terrence and Courtney's high-rise building. I rolled my window down just a crack, letting the crisp November air fill the cabin, and waited. Less than 20 minutes later, a massive, heavy-duty flatbed tow truck turned the corner and backed slowly into the luxury lot. The seasoned tow truck operator hopped out of the cab, checked the license plate against his clipboard, and immediately got to work. He did not hesitate. He positioned the hydraulic lift under the front tires of the gleaming black Escalade. This car was Terrence's absolute pride and joy. It was the physical manifestation of his entire fake persona. It was the vehicle he leaned against to brag to my father, the status symbol he used to convince the world he was a highly successful business consultant instead of an unemployed fraud. The loud whine of the hydraulic winch echoed through the quiet Saturday morning as the massive luxury tank was slowly pulled up onto the steel ramp. Just as the operator was securing the heavy chain straps over the rear tires, the heavy glass doors of the apartment lobby violently swung open. Terrence walked out wearing expensive designer sunglasses and holding a cup of artisan coffee. He was likely heading out to show off his stolen wealth at some upscale brunch. He casually glanced toward his premium parking spot, and his entire body froze. The plastic coffee cup slipped right through his fingers, shattering against the concrete pavement and splashing brown liquid all over his expensive leather shoes. Terrence let out a visceral shout and broke into a full sprint across the parking lot. He charged at the tow truck operator, waving his arms aggressively and screaming at the top of his lungs to drop his car. I watched from across the street as the operator calmly stepped back, pulled the legal recovery order from his clipboard, and shoved it right into Terrence's chest. Terrence read the paper, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple. He realized instantly that I had authorized the seizure. He completely lost his mind. He began kicking the heavy steel side of the flatbed, screaming profanities at the sky, and violently pulling on the locked door handle of the Escalade, desperate to stop the repossession. The operator completely ignored his tantrum, climbed into the cab, and drove the truck right out of the lot, taking Terrence's fake empire with him. Terrence stood alone in the empty parking space, breathing heavily and looking absolutely pathetic. He aggressively pulled his cell phone from his pocket, furiously stabbing the screen with his thumb. I knew he was calling me to deliver another barrage of terrifying threats. But as my phone began to vibrate silently on the passenger seat beside me, I just smiled. Terrence was throwing a violent tantrum over a piece of metal, completely unaware of the much larger trap that had just snapped shut behind him. He had absolutely no idea that while he was screaming at the tow truck driver, I had officially hit submit on a massive federal tax fraud dossier, sending every single detail of his illegal business income directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. I drove back to my apartment, feeling a profound sense of clarity. The $85,000 weight had been officially lifted from my credit profile, but I knew the shockwave of that public repossession was already traveling rapidly through my toxic family network. By the time I pulled into my secure underground parking garage, my cell phone had logged 14 missed calls from my mother and 6 from my father. I ignored every single one of them. I rode the elevator up to my floor, greeted the weekend nanny, and checked on Lily. She was completely oblivious to the financial war raging outside, peacefully watching an animated movie on the living room sofa while eating a bowl of strawberries. I paid the nanny a generous bonus for the extra hours and sent her home. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a fresh glass of iced water, and braced my nerves. I knew my parents would not just let this go. They were the ultimate enablers, and their precious golden child had just been attacked. Barely 20 minutes later, the heavy brass knocker on my front door began to pound furiously. It was not the steady, authoritative knock of the police like the night before. It was the frantic, entitled pounding of my parents demanding immediate attention. I walked to the door, checked the digital peephole, and saw my father, Richard, red in the face. My mother, Patricia, was standing right behind him, gripping her designer handbag and looking absolutely murderous. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door just enough to stand firmly in the threshold. I physically blocked the entryway, refusing to let their chaotic energy anywhere near Lily. Before I could even say a word of greeting, my mother launched into a vicious, unhinged verbal assault. Her voice echoed loudly down the quiet hallway, completely ignoring the fact that my neighbors could hear every word. She screamed that I was an out-of-control, vindictive witch. She demanded to know how I could possibly be so cruel, petty, and insanely jealous of my sister's perfect marriage. Patricia pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes wide with rage. She yelled that Terrence is a proud black man in America trying to build a corporate consulting empire from the ground up against all odds. She shrieked that he absolutely needs that luxury vehicle for his professional image when meeting with high-level investors, and that my petty stunt had completely humiliated him in front of his entire residential building. My father immediately chimed in aggressively, demanding that I pick up my phone call, the towing company pay whatever exorbitant release fees they were asking, and personally drive the Cadillac back to Terrence with a massive groveling apology. I stood there perfectly still, letting their toxic barrage wash over me, without flinching or breaking eye contact. When they finally paused to catch their breath, expecting me to cower and apologize like I always did, I looked at them with absolute freezing disgust. I kept my voice cold flat and completely devoid of any daughterly affection. I told them they were living in a pathetic delusional fantasy. I stated clearly that Terrence is not a successful entrepreneur, he is an unemployed con artist. I explained that the luxury car was not a hard-earned business asset. It was the direct result of federal identity theft committed using my stolen social security number. I told them they were blindly enabling a dangerous criminal syndicate who not only stole $50,000 from my credit lines, but also severely physically and psychologically abused their own 6-year-old granddaughter. I informed them that Child Protective Services had already removed Lily from their custody. My parents scoffed loudly in unison, entirely rejecting reality. My father aggressively waved his hand, completely dismissing the abuse allegations and the financial crimes as dramatic lies I had fabricated to justify my bitter jealousy. He told me I was sick in the head and that they would never believe a single word I said over Courtney's truth. I realized then that they were so deeply brainwashed by their golden child that morality and facts would never pierce their armor. Only total financial ruin could do that. I told them to wait exactly 1 second. I turned around, walked over to my kitchen island, and picked up a heavy manila envelope I had received from a major lending bank earlier that week. I walked back to the front door and shoved the envelope directly into my father's chest. I told him he should be much less concerned about Terrence's fake professional image and much more concerned about where he and Patricia were going to sleep next month. Richard ripped open the envelope and pulled out the thick legal notice. I watched the arrogant color completely drain from his face as his eyes scanned the bold red lettering. I calmly explained that when they thought they were co-signing a simple business loan to help Courtney invest in Terrence's fake consulting firm, they had actually co-signed a high-interest collateral loan. And because Courtney and Terrence had completely defaulted on the payments to fund their Cabo vacation, the bank had officially placed a foreclosure lien on their beautiful suburban home. My father stared blindly at the bold red print of the foreclosure notice, his hands trembling violently. The arrogant bluster had completely vanished from his face, replaced by the crushing realization that his blind devotion to his golden child was about to leave him entirely homeless. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I did not give them a chance to formulate another pathetic excuse or hurl another insult. I simply told them to get off my property, and I gently but firmly closed the heavy wooden door right in their faces. I locked the deadbolt, walked back to my kitchen island, and took a deep, refreshing breath. The dominoes were falling exactly as I had calculated. Across town, the situation inside Courtney and Terrence's luxury apartment was rapidly deteriorating into absolute chaos. With the $85,000 Escalade currently sitting in an impound lot, and my furious parents aggressively calling them about their impending foreclosure, Terrence was demanding immediate cash. He ordered Courtney to log into her personal bank accounts, transfer the funds to pay the massive repossession fees, and wire an emergency mortgage payment to stop the bank from seizing our parents' house. Courtney confidently opened her laptop, fully expecting to use her own savings to bail them out of this temporary setback. She navigated to her premier banking portal, typed in her secure credentials, and hit enter. But instead of seeing her account balances, her screen was immediately overtaken by a stark flashing red error message. She frantically refreshed the page, assuming it was a simple network glitch. The red banner remained, displaying a severe federal compliance code, indicating that all assets associated with her social security number were currently restricted. She grabbed her cell phone and dialed the premium customer service line, ready to scream at a bank teller. But the automated voice on the other end calmly informed her that her accounts had been indefinitely frozen under the direct orders of the Internal Revenue Service and federal financial regulators. They had completely underestimated what happens when you cross a licensed forensic accountant. I had not just called a local police precinct to complain about a stolen credit card. I had compiled a massive airtight dossier detailing every single fraudulent transaction, the fake welfare applications, and the sophisticated money laundering tactics Terrence was using to hide his supposed business income. I submitted that dossier directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS and the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Because Courtney had foolishly transferred money from the fraudulent credit lines into her own personal checking accounts to pay for her Cabo vacation, she had deeply commingled stolen funds with her own assets. The federal government does not play games with wire fraud. They immediately executed a hard legal freeze on every single penny she possessed, pending a full criminal audit. They were entirely, completely broke. They could not buy a cup of coffee, let alone save a foreclosed home. Less than an hour after my parents left my door, my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed my sister's name. I let it ring 3 times before I casually swiped to answer. There was no heavy bass, no club music, and no condescending laughter this time. The only sound coming through the speaker was the sound of Courtney crying hysterically. It was a chaotic, hyperventilating panic. She choked on her own tears as she screamed that all of her money was gone, that the bank refused to speak to her, and that Terrence was throwing glass bottles against the living room wall. She begged me for mercy. She sobbed, pleading with me to call my bank and tell them it was all just a big misunderstanding. She promised that if I just unlocked her checking account, she would pay me back every single dime they took. She told me I was her sister and that I could not possibly let her lose everything. It was truly pathetic to hear the golden child, who just days ago had mocked my career and thanked me for the cash, absolutely groveling for her financial life. I sat in my quiet, peaceful apartment, listening to her hysterical breakdown without a single ounce of pity. I kept my voice freezing cold and perfectly even. I told her that I did not freeze her accounts, the federal government did. I told her that the time for apologies had expired the moment she forged my name to steal a child's trust fund. Courtney wailed into the phone, asking me what she was supposed to do now. I looked at the calendar on my kitchen wall and delivered the final blow. I told her there is a mandatory meeting at the trust attorney's office tomorrow at 10 in the morning. Be there, or you go to jail tomorrow instead of next week. I hung up the phone, ending the call on my terms. The next morning, at exactly 9:45, I parked my car in the secure underground garage of the prestigious downtown high-rise that housed David Thorne's law firm. I held Lily's hand as we rode the private elevator up to the 40th floor. I had arranged for us to wait in a secondary conference room while my family arrived. I wanted them to sit in the main boardroom and stew in their own anxiety before I made my entrance. Through the heavy glass walls of the reception area, my attorney's paralegal kept me updated on their arrival. They walked through the double-glass doors of the firm, looking like absolute shadows of their former selves. They were escorted into the massive, luxurious boardroom. The room featured a polished mahogany table that stretched 20 feet long, surrounded by plush leather chairs and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. It was an environment designed to intimidate, but my family was far too arrogant to realize they were walking straight into a legal slaughterhouse. I watched the closed-circuit security feed on the paralegal's tablet, observing their behavior from the safety of the room next door. Courtney and Terrence looked completely haggard. Because the Escalade was sitting in a repo lot and Courtney's bank accounts were entirely frozen, they had been forced to rely on my parents to drive them downtown. Courtney was wearing yesterday's makeup, her eyes puffy and bloodshot from crying all night. Terrence's expensive tailored suit looked wrinkled, and he paced the length of the boardroom like a caged animal. My father, Richard, sat heavily in one of the leather chairs, rubbing his temples, clearly agonizing over the foreclosure notice sitting on his kitchen counter. Patricia sat next to him, her posture rigid, clutching her designer bag as if holding onto it would somehow stop her world from collapsing. Despite their absolute financial ruin, they still believed they could bully their way out of this situation. When David Thorne finally entered the boardroom and took his seat at the head of the long table, the illusion of their superiority flared back to life. Terrence immediately stopped pacing, leaned his hands aggressively on the polished wood, and pointed a finger directly at the high-powered estate attorney. Terrence loudly declared that this entire situation was a massive misunderstanding, blown completely out of proportion by a jealous sister. He aggressively demanded that David immediately process the trust transfer documents and release the $4.5 million into Courtney's name. When David simply looked back at him with a cold, unbothered expression, Terrence escalated his tactics. He slammed his fist on the table and threatened to sue David, the law firm, and the entire Vanguard Trust Corporation for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. He claimed he had elite lawyers on retainer who would tie this firm up in litigation for decades if they did not hand over the money today. It was a completely empty threat from a man who could not even afford a cup of coffee that morning. My mother, Patricia, immediately chimed in to support him. She raised her chin, putting on her most authoritative, condescending voice. She told David that family matters can sometimes be messy, but that Courtney is the biological mother and the rightful heir to that money. She demanded that the trust be released to Courtney immediately so they could put this unfortunate family squabble behind them. She explicitly told the attorney that my erratic behavior was the only roadblock, and since I had clearly suffered a mental breakdown, my previous signatures or objections should be entirely legally voided. They were completely delusional. They were sitting in the office of one of the most ruthless estate litigators in the city, actively attempting to extort him with loud voices and baseless threats. David Thorne did not interrupt them. He did not argue or attempt to explain the law. He simply sat back in his expensive leather chair, steepled his fingers together, and let them talk. He was letting them verbally confirm their intent to bypass the legal trust structure, all while his paralegal took meticulous shorthand notes in the corner of the room. Every threat they made just added another brick to the prison wall they were building around themselves. I looked down at Lily, who was quietly coloring in a book the paralegal had given her. I asked her if she was ready to go say hello. She nodded bravely and took my hand. I walked out of the secondary room and down the quiet, carpeted hallway toward the main boardroom. I did not knock. I simply reached out and pushed the heavy oak doors wide open. The loud, aggressive arguing inside the room stopped instantly. Richard, Patricia, Courtney, and Terrence all turned their heads simultaneously to look at the doorway. I walked into the luxurious boardroom holding Lily securely by the hand. My posture was perfectly straight, and my face was entirely devoid of any emotion. But the absolute terror that suddenly washed over my family's faces was not because I had brought the child they had physically abused. The color completely drained from Terrence's face, and Courtney let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, because they saw exactly who was walking into the room right behind me. Following closely at my heels were two tall, broad-shouldered men wearing dark conservative suits and carrying heavy metal briefcases. The two men stepped past me and walked straight toward the long mahogany table. They did not say a word at first. They simply reached inside the breast pockets of their dark suits and pulled out leather wallets. They flipped them open simultaneously, letting the heavy gold shields catch the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. The taller man introduced himself as Special Agent Miller with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically assigned to the White-Collar Crimes Division. The second man introduced himself as Special Agent Vance with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The luxurious boardroom went absolutely terrifyingly silent. You could hear a pin drop on the thick carpet. The loud, arrogant bluster that had consumed the room just seconds prior vanished completely into thin air. My father slumped back into his leather chair, his mouth hanging slightly open as all the color drained from his face. My mother gripped the edge of the table so hard, her knuckles turned stark white. Terrence stood completely frozen, his eyes darting frantically between the two federal agents, blocking the only exit to the room. I gently guided Lily over to the corner of the room where David Thorne's paralegal was sitting. The kind woman offered Lily a bright smile and a fresh box of crayons, keeping her safely distracted from the adults. With my niece secure, I turned around and walked purposefully to the head of the massive table. I did not sit down. I stood tall, looked my family dead in the eyes, and placed my heavy leather tote bag on the polished wood. I reached inside and began to systematically lay out the exact same evidence I had prepared for the state authorities the night before. I pulled out the first folder and dropped it right in front of Terrence. I told him that was the official emergency protective order signed by a judge late last night. I explained that because they had so brilliantly forged my name on the state birth certificate to bypass the background check, I was legally recognized as the mother. I informed them that Child Protective Services had thoroughly interviewed Lily, documented the severe physical and psychological abuse, and permanently barred both of them from ever coming near my child again. Courtney let out a choked, devastated sob, realizing her own criminal paperwork had been legally weaponized against her to strip away her parental rights. I did not give them a second to recover. I pulled out the second heavy folder and dropped it in front of my father. I told him he should read that very carefully. I explained that it contained the comprehensive forensic financial audit I had personally conducted and submitted to the federal government. I outlined the $50,000 in stolen credit, the fraudulent state welfare applications, and the $85,000 luxury vehicle I had repossessed right out of their parking lot. I looked at Courtney and casually mentioned that her personal bank accounts were not suffering from a temporary network glitch. I told her the federal government had frozen every single asset she possessed because she had stupidly commingled stolen funds with her own money. Finally, I reached into my bag and pulled out my encrypted tablet. I placed it right in the center of the table, turned the volume all the way up, and pressed play. The crystal-clear, high-definition audio of our Thanksgiving dinner filled the silent boardroom. My family was forced to sit there and listen to their own voices. They heard Terrence aggressively threatening to frame me for welfare fraud and send me to federal prison. They heard my mother telling me to just sign the paper and stop ruining the holiday. And they heard Courtney laughing cruelly, explicitly thanking me for the cash. Agent Miller stepped forward, his voice cold and authoritative. He looked directly at Courtney and Terrence and stated that they were officially under investigation for multiple counts of aggravated identity theft, federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. He informed them that the audio recording I provided was a flawless, uncontested confession to extortion and coercion. The sheer magnitude of the situation finally crashed down on Terrence. The fake alpha male facade, the arrogant business consultant persona, and the intimidating bully routine completely shattered into a million pieces. He realized he was staring down the barrel of a decade in federal prison. He backed away from the mahogany table, his hands raised in the air as if he was physically surrendering to the agents. His eyes were wide with absolute panic. He looked at the federal agents, pointed a trembling finger directly at his own wife, and screamed that he had nothing to do with it. He shouted that it was all her idea. He yelled that she was the one who forged the signatures and did all the paperwork. Courtney's eyes widened in absolute shock as the words left her husband's mouth. For a split second, the room was completely frozen as her brain processed the ultimate betrayal. The man she had committed massive federal felonies for, the man she had allowed to abuse her own daughter just to secure a payday, had just entirely thrown her to the wolves to save his own skin. The shock instantly mutated into blinding, explosive rage. Courtney let out a guttural scream that echoed off the expensive glass walls of the boardroom. She lunged forward across the mahogany table, completely ignoring the presence of the federal agents. She grabbed Terrence by the lapels of his expensive wrinkled suit and began violently shaking him. She screamed that he was a pathetic, worthless coward. She yelled that he was the one who forced her to forge the welfare documents and that the luxury car was entirely his idea. Terrence shoved her back aggressively, stumbling over one of the heavy leather chairs in his desperate attempt to get away from her manic fingernails. He shouted right back, pointing at the financial audit binder, claiming he never signed a single piece of paper and that her fingerprints were all over the fake birth certificate. The pristine, sophisticated illusion of their high society marriage completely disintegrated right in front of our eyes. They were no longer a wealthy power couple. They were two desperate, cornered criminals violently tearing each other apart to avoid a prison sentence. Special Agent Miller and Special Agent Vance did not let the chaotic spectacle continue for more than a few seconds. They moved with swift, practiced precision. Agent Miller grabbed Terrence by the shoulder, spun him around, and shoved him face first against the polished glass of the boardroom window. He forcefully pulled Terrence's arms behind his back. The sharp, heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the room with terrifying finality. At the exact same moment, Agent Vance intercepted my sister. He gripped Courtney by the wrists, swiftly turning her around and locking her hands securely behind her back. Agent Miller's voice boomed over their panicked shouting, officially reciting their Miranda rights. He told them they had the right to remain silent, and judging by the massive amount of mutual incrimination they had just screamed at each other, he highly suggested they use it. The clinical, emotionless tone of the federal agent reading those constitutional rights brought a crushing wave of reality crashing down onto the family. My parents watched the entire violent takedown in a state of absolute paralyzing horror. My father, Richard, was gripping the arms of his leather chair so tightly, his hands were shaking uncontrollably. His jaw was slack, his eyes darting between his handcuffed son-in-law and his sobbing golden child. The perfect, successful daughter he had worshipped and protected for 34 years was currently being physically restrained by federal law enforcement. All the lies, all the excuses, and all the toxic enabling had finally collided with a brick wall of justice. Seeing the cold steel cuffs wrapped tightly around her precious daughter's wrists finally broke my mother. Patricia let out a heartbreaking, agonizing wail. Her legs completely gave out beneath her. She collapsed right onto the thick, expensive boardroom carpet. She crawled on her hands and knees toward where I was standing at the head of the table. Tears streamed down her face, completely ruining her expensive makeup. She reached out with trembling hands, desperately grabbing the hem of my gray sweater. Patricia looked up at me, her eyes filled with a level of sheer panic and desperation I had never seen before. She begged me to call it off. She sobbed violently, pleading with me to tell the agents it was all a big misunderstanding. She cried that Courtney would not survive in a federal prison. She said, "She is your sister, Natalie. She is your own flesh and blood. You cannot do this to your own family." She was begging me to magically fix the absolute catastrophe they had created, still entirely believing that my sole purpose in life was to absorb their collateral damage and shield them from the consequences of their own actions. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, and no sadness. I gently but firmly pulled the fabric of my sweater out of her desperate grasp and took a slow step back, ensuring she could no longer touch me. I looked past my sobbing mother and locked eyes directly with my father, who was still sitting frozen in his chair. I kept my voice incredibly calm, clear, and perfectly level. I told my father you said I should do my duty for the family. I am. I am taking out the trash. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung shut, cutting off the frantic, hysterical apologies of my mother. Special Agent Miller and Special Agent Vance did not hesitate. They marched Terrence and Courtney out of the luxurious office, down the private elevator, and straight into the back of a federal transport vehicle waiting in the underground garage. I did not stay to watch my parents pick themselves up off the expensive carpet. I simply turned my back on them, walked over to the corner where Lily was happily finishing her drawing with the paralegal, and gently took her small hand. We walked out of the Vanguard Heritage and Trust Building together, stepping into the crisp Chicago air. For the first time in my 32 years of life, my chest felt completely light. The suffocating weight of my family's toxic expectations had finally been lifted. The next few weeks were an absolute whirlwind of aggressive legal proceedings and federal indictments. Because Terrence and Courtney were facing severe federal charges of wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and tax evasion, the magistrate judge immediately denied their bail. They were deemed extreme flight risks, especially considering their history of using stolen credit to book international luxury flights. They were sent directly to a federal holding facility to await trial. The swift and brutal reality of the federal justice system completely broke them. Without their luxury clothes, their expensive cars, and their fake social media personas, they were nothing but common criminals facing a decade behind bars. While the federal prosecutors dismantled their financial crimes, my estate attorney, David Thorne, went to work in family court. The Child Protective Services investigation had concluded rapidly. The documented evidence of severe psychological conditioning, the physical bruises on Lily's arms, and the audio recording of Terrence threatening to lock her in a dark cage were more than enough for the state. The family court judge permanently severed all parental rights from Courtney and Terrence. They were legally stripped of any claim to the child and permanently barred from ever contacting her again. But the most brilliant legal victory came during the final custody hearing. Normally, adopting a child out of the state system is a grueling, highly invasive process filled with endless bureaucratic red tape. But David Thorne presented an incredibly unique argument to the presiding judge. He pointed out that Courtney and Terrence had already submitted a flawless state-issued birth certificate, legally naming me as the biological mother from the very first day Lily was born. They had filed it with the hospital, the school district, and multiple federal government agencies. David argued that formally reversing the fraudulent birth certificate would needlessly force Lily into the foster system and cause massive emotional trauma to a child who was currently thriving in a safe, loving home. The judge reviewed the overwhelming evidence, looked at the happy little girl sitting safely next to me in the courtroom, and made a landmark decision. He brought his heavy wooden gavel down and legally bound the forged document. He ruled that the birth certificate would remain entirely intact and permanently sealed by the court. My sister's massive calculated federal felony had essentially bypassed the entire adoption process for me. I was now completely and legally Lily's mother in the eyes of the law. With my legal status permanently cemented by a federal judge, Vanguard Heritage and Trust had absolutely no further objections. David Thorne officially filed the transfer paperwork. Within 48 hours, the massive corporate hold was released. I was granted full uncontested fiduciary control over the $4.5 million generational wealth trust. My grandfather's money was finally safe, completely out of the reach of the greedy hands he had tried so hard to avoid. As I secured Lily's financial future, the absolute devastation of my family's choices finally caught up with my parents. Richard and Patricia had spent their entire lives treating me like a disposable tool while blindly worshipping their golden child. When they confidently co-signed that high-interest collateral loan to fund Terrence's fake business empire, they had essentially signed their own financial death warrant. Because all of Courtney's assets were permanently seized by the federal government, there was absolutely no money left to stop the bleeding. The bank moved with ruthless corporate efficiency. They finalized the foreclosure on my parents' beautiful, sprawling suburban colonial home. Richard and Patricia were formally evicted. They were forced to pack whatever belongings they could fit into a rented moving truck and watch as the bank changed the locks on their heavy front door. Their perfect, wealthy facade was completely destroyed. They were left entirely bankrupt, severely in debt, and completely alone with absolutely nothing. 6 months have passed since the heavy oak doors of that boardroom closed on my past forever. Today, the crisp spring air flows freely through the open windows of our brand-new house, nestled in a quiet, heavily wooded suburb outside of Chicago. I did not dip into a single penny of my grandfather's trust fund to buy this beautiful property. I used my own hard-earned savings and the substantial bonus from a massive promotion I recently received at my corporate firm. The $4.5 million remains entirely untouched. It is safely invested, growing exponentially in a secure, diversified portfolio strictly designated for Lily's future. It is her money, and I am merely the fierce guardian protecting it until she is ready. The transformation I have witnessed in Lily over these last 6 months has been nothing short of miraculous. When she first came to live with me, she was a quiet, terrified shadow of a little girl. She used to flinch if a kitchen cabinet closed too loudly, and she would constantly apologize for simply existing in the same room. I enrolled her in specialized play therapy to help her process the severe trauma her biological parents inflicted on her. The progress has been beautiful to watch. Now the sound of her genuine, uninhibited laughter fills every single corner of this large house. She is thriving in her new elementary school, making wonderful friends and discovering a deep, vibrant passion for painting. We transformed a sunny room at the back of the house into a dedicated art studio just for her. Yesterday, she came running up to me holding a bright, messy watercolor painting of the two of us standing proudly in our new garden. She handed it to me, wrapped her arms tightly around my waist, and called me Mom. Not a scripted title forced upon her by an abusive father, but a true, earned declaration of love. It was a title I never thought I would hold, but now it is the most important and fulfilling role of my entire life. As for the people who used to call themselves my family, the federal justice system handled them with the exact level of clinical ruthlessness they deserved. Last month, I sat in the back row of a federal courtroom and watched a judge hand down their official sentences. Terrence was sentenced to 9 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, identity theft, and tax evasion. His arrogant smirk was completely gone, replaced by the terrified realization that his fake luxury empire was erased forever. Courtney received a 7-year sentence for her active role in the conspiracy and for violating her previous felony probation. They are locked away in separate facilities, entirely stripped of the unearned privilege they thought was their birthright. My parents, Richard and Patricia, are currently renting a tiny, dilapidated one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. After the bank foreclosed on their massive suburban colonial home, their wealthy social circle completely abandoned them. They tried to reach out to me a few times during the holidays, leaving pathetic, sobbing voicemails, begging for financial assistance, and claiming they had finally seen the error of their ways. I did not call them back. I did not send them a dime. I simply blocked their phone numbers, blocked their email addresses, and instructed the security gate at my new neighborhood to turn them away immediately if they ever showed up. I went entirely, permanently no contact. I do not feel a single ounce of guilt or regret. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you, and I refuse to let their toxic poison ever seep into our peaceful lives again. Looking back on my childhood, I realize now how fundamentally my family misunderstood me. They looked at my quiet demeanor and my willingness to keep the peace, and they saw absolute weakness. They labeled me the scapegoat because I chose to study and build a stable career instead of loudly demanding attention. They genuinely believed that because I did not fight back with screaming matches or dramatic tantrums, I was an easy target. They assumed my pristine legal identity was just a convenient tool for them to exploit, completely forgetting that the very career I built was centered around dismantling complex financial webs and exposing liars. They mistook my patience for stupidity and my silence for compliance. In the end, it was my intellect, my meticulous attention to detail, and my absolute refusal to be a victim that entirely destroyed them. They tried to steal my name, but all they did was give me a daughter and a fortune. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe. Remember, the best revenge isn't just surviving, it's succeeding on your own terms. The harrowing journey we just witnessed teaches us a profound and necessary lesson about navigating toxic family dynamics. Silence and composure are often dangerously mistaken for weakness. For years, Natalie's family assumed that her refusal to engage in their dramatic, screaming conflicts meant she was a fragile, compliant target ready for exploitation. They believed her peaceful nature equated to a fundamental lack of boundaries. However, the true strength of a scapegoat lies not in fighting fire with fire, but in emotional detachment and strategic thinking. When faced with the ultimate betrayal of having her identity stolen and witnessing the systemic abuse of an innocent child, Natalie did not react with the hysterical panic her abusers expected. Instead, she weaponized her intellect. Toxic individuals thrive on emotional chaos because it is the exact smokescreen they use to hide their misdeeds, gaslight their victims, and maintain control. By remaining impeccably calm and stepping out of the emotional battlefield, Natalie completely denied them their ammunition. She allowed their own unchecked arrogance to blind them to the legal trap they were building around themselves. This narrative powerfully illustrates that we are never morally obligated to set ourselves on fire just to keep our abusive relatives warm. Society often weaponizes the idea of family loyalty to coerce victims into endless cycles of forgiveness. But this story proves that setting ironclad boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-respect and necessary self-preservation. The cold, objective truth will always outlast the loudest, most aggressive lies. We must learn to recognize our own inherent worth and utterly refuse to be the collateral damage in someone else's fraudulent life. If you are currently dealing with manipulative people who mistake your kindness for weakness, start documenting the truth and prioritize your own peace over their toxic demands today.